So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our book talk tonight. I'm very excited to see everybody and I'd love to get to know you all. So if you want to drop your name, where you're from, and what motivated you to sign up for this, would love to hear from you all. And my name is Nica Cave. I am a mobility advocate and I am here with Pedestrian Dignity tonight, joined by Jonathan, Alejandra, and Justin. And tonight we will be talking about this book, When Driving is Not an Option by Anna Zivarts. And I'm thrilled to introduce her. So again, co-hosting with Pedestrian Dignity, and we really center the raw lived experience of folks who have no choice but to walk, roll, and take transit, which is what this book really centers on. So one second here. All right, so again, welcome Anna. Thank you for being with us. A little bit about Anna before we pass it over to her. So Anna is a low vision parent, a non-driver, and the brilliant author behind When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. And this was published this year, so relatively new. And Anna is not just an author, she is a passionate advocate for non-drivers. And she has brought the voices of non-drivers into the forefront of planning with the Week Without Driving initiative, which has been huge in the last couple of years. I've been grateful to be a part of that. And a little bit about non-drivers and transit and walkability for those who are not very familiar, but in the US, 1/3 of people do not have a driver's license. And many of these involuntary non-drivers, who include disabled individuals, low-income communities, unhoused people, kids, young people, elderly, and others, are often invisible within a mobility system that is designed almost entirely for people who drive. When driving is not an option, sheds a light on the reality that makes a compelling case for why redesigning our transportation system with non-drivers can create a system that really works for all of us. And so during this event, Anna will share her insights and explain about how viewing the needs of non-drivers can really foster a much more accessible and sustainable community for all of us. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome up Anna. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Feel free to introduce yourself and the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be with you all. And I got connected to Jonathan last summer when he was in Seattle doing his book talk. And before that, he led this walk roll around the neighborhood. And the group I work for, Disability Rights Washington, we decided to show up with some folks, and it was such an incredible event, and it really made me realize, how special the spaces he creates are, and how he really allows people to find their voices. And so I'm really, really, when he offered to do a book talk event for me with you all, I was honored, and I'm really excited to meet everyone here today. And thank you, Nica, for hosting. So a little bit more about me. I'm gonna share some slides. I know traditionally in a book talk you do a reading, but that is tricky for me to do. So I was born with a vision condition called nystagmus. It's neurological. It basically is something in my brain is telling my eyes to shake all the time when I'm awake. And so it makes it difficult for me to see far distances. It also, reading is something that I have a hard time reading out loud. And especially if I'm reading something, I have to hold it really close to my face so you can't see my face at all. And so I have intentionally not been doing book readings. And I was like, oh my gosh, can you do a book and not do book readings? And then I read somewhere, I was kind of obsessed with Octavia Butler, the science fiction author. This year, Seattle Public Library, she's like the author of the year. And I was doing a bunch of reading about her, reading some of her books. And first of all, she never drove, which I thought was cool. And she also didn't do readings. When she did book talks, she didn't read from the book. And I was like, well, if she didn't read from books, maybe I can do it too. So I'm gonna share some images with you all and talk a little bit about the images and give you a sense of what's in the book and why I wrote this book. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to get up close and personal with my screen to see what I'm doing. So hang on here as you get a good close view of my forehead. And let's see. All right, so we should have this, and I'm going to go into slideshow. All right. While it thinks about, there we go. All right. So, as I mentioned, I was born with this eye condition, and I grew up in Washington State. This picture on the left is an image of the road where I grew up. It is pretty rural. There's, big tall trees like the Northwest has. It's a a high-speed rural road, no sidewalks, no shoulders. And growing up here, I thought I didn't even think about not driving, right, growing up. And then I went in to try to take the vision test at the DMV and I failed. So I couldn't get my driver's permit. And I still really didn't have a plan. I had a friend try to teach me how to drive. And she let me drive her. She was going to teach me how to drive stick in her mom's pickup truck. And she did that. And it was in the parking lot at a university. And I drove her mom's truck up a tree and smashed up the truck pretty badly. And that scared both of us. It scared me a lot. And it made me realize that it wasn't going to be safe for me to drive, even if I really wanted to. And so, growing up here in this place in the woods, I really felt that like every adult I knew could drive and had a car. And I didn't see another option for how to be an adult other than asking my parents to drive me everywhere, which was not something I wanted to do as a teenager. It's still not something I like to do now. And so then I basically I heard that the New York City there was a subway system and it ran 24 hours a day, and I was like, I need to go to New York City. That is where I belong. And so I moved to New York City. And this image on the right is the street that I lived in New York. I lived in a lot of different neighborhoods, but this was one of the neighborhoods I lived, the last neighborhood before I left New York. And just a very different environment than that street that I grew up on. There's a subway overhead, overhead subway tracks. There's tons of pedestrians, lots of stores. I think there's like a Dominican bakery right there where you can get delicious food and a cell phone store right there, like all the things you need. And I was living in New York, and then I had a kid, and my kid was born with the same eye condition I had. And
wow.
that made me sort of have a moment of self-reflection because in New York City, I wasn't very public about my disability. I didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't have to because it was normal to not drive, right? It was normal. I didn't ever have to explain to someone, oh, I can't get to your house because I don't have a ride, right? Or, with a job application, it was never a question, do you have a driver's license? And so when he was born, I had this sort of deep emotional reaction that was like I was very upset. I was very sad about his disability. And I started to have a bit of reflection on how that was really about my own childhood and my own feelings of sort of isolation, and how I really needed to understand more about the disability community, which had evolved so much since the 80s when I was born to a place of, much more acceptance and much more pride. And I through Twitter at that point, this was like in 2016, I started following a lot of disability accounts, getting sort of involved in that discussion online. And then a friend from my home state who I'd gone to high school with forwarded me a job for Disability Rights Washington, which is a disability rights organization in Washington State. And it was to lead their video storytelling team. And I've been doing video storytelling work in New York. And she's like, this is the job for you. And I was like, oh my gosh, maybe it is. So I applied and I got it. And we moved back to Washington State. And right away on my team, of the people that I worked with, there were a team of 9. There were many people on that team who couldn't drive. Most people couldn't drive. And it was so affirming to me to sort of be in a place where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone in Washington State. There are a lot of other non-drivers. And then in the work we were doing, we were making videos about a whole bunch of different disability issues, but there kept on being transportation issues that were coming up. And we started making a lot of videos about transportation. And eventually, at the start of the pandemic, things at work sort of shifted around, and I was able to convince our executive director to let me launch a program specifically focused on transportation access and storytelling around the population of non-drivers in Washington State. And at that point, I was sort of, I knew I wanted to tell the stories of people who were disabled and couldn't drive because of their disabilities. But as I started doing that work, I realized very quickly that it wasn't a binary between someone who um, identified as disabled or someone who didn't. Like there was all kinds of nuance. There was all kinds of, there was people who, couldn't drive because of a disability, but didn't identify as disabled. A lot of older folks were in that category. And so I was trying to think of a different way to talk about it. And I also, because I've been in New York and had done so much work for years and years in like labor movements and social justice, wanted knew that there were many people who couldn't afford to drive, right? Especially in immigrant communities. And so wanted to be able to talk about all of our needs collectively and not have disability be its own separate thing. Because that's sort of what happens so often in the disability community is we sort of are like, oh, we're different. And so therefore we have these special rights. We have the ADA, and it doesn't allow us to do this sort of intersectional organizing across communities that we could be doing, because at the end of the day, we all benefit from better sidewalks, from better transit, from accessible communities. So that's how the work began. And we did this story map project where we went out and we interviewed 300 folks from every legislative district, across every legislative district in our state, all 49 legislative districts. That story map's still available online. There's an image here of my colleague Abby and I. Abby's now a tremendous transit organizer down in the Portland area in Oregon, but doing outreach at a community event. But a lot of it was actually online because it was, during the thick of the pandemic. And so in the book, I talk about sort of the history of how this happened. And then I also spend a chapter really getting into who are non-drivers. Like if we're talking about this as a community, who are we? And what are our mobility needs and what do we have in common? And so just to sort of give you a sense of, and I think Nica read some of these categories, but I'll talk about them just real quick and then we'll get into the Q&A piece. But first of all, there's, and the book really does center people with disabilities because that's the community I come from. And it's a community that I think there's less understood about. And so, people with vision disabilities, obviously, have difficult times driving safely. People with mobility disabilities sometimes can't drive or need a, hand controlled vehicle, or perhaps need a wheelchair accessible vehicle, which they may or may not be able to afford because those are expensive. There's an image here of Erica, who can drive and actually has a car, but it's not a wheelchair accessible car. And so if she wants to use her power chair anywhere, she has to take transit. She can't take her vehicle. And so, I consider her to be a non-driver, even though she has some ability to drive. It's not, it's not exactly a strict binary, right? There's all sorts of nuance. I mentioned older folks. This image on the bottom left is my grandma. She had a heart condition. She lived in rural southern Indiana before she passed away, and she kept driving. And she kept driving off the road because she would pass out. And so, because so many of our communities are so car dependent, we have a lot of folks that are aging out of driving, and it's not safe for them to continue driving, but there really aren't options for them, other than uprooting or other than sort of being institutionalized into a nursing home. And she really didn't want that, right? She wanted to stay in her house on the farm, that can make it work. And so that's another big portion of the population of non-drivers. This image on the upper right is an image of my son and a neighbor's son waiting for the school bus. People who are too young to get driver's licenses are a big percentage of the non-driver population. And sometimes I get pushback about including young folks. People are like, oh, you shouldn't include kids. And when you talk about the number of non-drivers, you say it's 30% of the population. How many of those are kids? And it is a lot. About 15% of the population are under the age of 16. But, I don't see a reason to exclude youth. Youth need to go places too. Kids need to go places too. We create these busing systems, right, specifically for, because we understand that not every child has a parent that can drive them everywhere they need to go. And then they still need to go places. And those, exist even in our really rural communities. We provide that kind of transportation for children. So yeah, kids count, and kids are part of the non-driver population. Young people as well. This image on the bottom right is some high school students waiting for the bus, my bus in Seattle, and we have free transit now for youth, which is awesome. But people and increasingly a bigger percentage of people between the ages of 16 and 25 are choosing not to or can't afford to get driver's licenses. And I heard some stories as I got on the call today from some folks who are, in that category. And I think, there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it, I'm sure, has to do with cost, but I think also, it has to do with, the stress of driving, right, and environmental concerns. And so, it's a big, when I was a teenager in the 90s, about 50% of 16-year-olds had driver's licenses, and that's down to 25% now. So big decrease. And then people who can't afford to drive, right? This is another big chunk of non-drivers. We saw this very visible. Again, this is another picture from my bus in Seattle. But during the pandemic, when some transit routes where people, that served low-income communities and communities of color had a lot of ridership. And they continued to have ridership. That ridership didn't go down even, in the thick of the pandemic because people didn't have other options. And so we know that car ownership is expensive. It's increasingly expensive. And it's, sometimes it doesn't make sense for a household to, invest in that if there are other options to use. So that's sort of a broad overview of non-drivers, who we are. I mentioned we're about 30% of the population nationally. That's higher in low-income areas, and some rural areas, and some urban areas for sure. But yeah, that's who we are. And I am going to turn it back over to Nica because I know there are some really great questions that the team prepared, and I want to get a chance to talk about those. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oops, if I can do
Thank you
that.
so much for sharing these pictures and your story and just so much rawness about all of this, so much honesty. I also wanted to say, just on a personal note, I'm a wheelchair user and I felt so represented in all of the stories in this book, just the variety of types of disabilities that were represented, the nuances. It's just very powerful and love to see that. And I think I would like to ask along those lines, so that is one of the perspectives that is sort of the central theme of this book is disability. And it reminds me of the concept of universal design and how if we build a city that works for disabled people, it ends up working for everybody. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about just what are sort of the tangible changes, things that we can implement that really end up benefiting everybody that people might not know about.
Yeah, I mean, I really think a lot of it has to do at the end of the day with how we are choosing to build our communities, and like build in a big sense, like where are we building housing, and where are we building the places that people need to go. And historically, right, it often is, I mean, there's all like, racism and white flight and people leaving cities for the suburbs. There's that factor, but then there's also the factor of, okay, land is cheapest on the far outskirts. So we'll build the school campus right on the far outside of town. And then all the kids have to either, cross a highway or be bused there. And so, yeah, for me, it's really like, how can we think about what would it take to make it easier for people to get where they need to go? And in some places, I'm not saying that everyone needs to live in a city. We can have great rural transit that can exist. But also, for people who want to be able to afford to live somewhere where things are closer, we have such a profound housing crisis, and the cost of housing in this country. I think that really is the root of almost everything that we talk about. Because without that change, the communities that are most walkable and most transit rich are exclusive because they become so desirable. And we priced out people who might most need that access. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm so happy you brought up the issue of housing. That was something that I have in my mind thinking about, of like how it intersects with transportation and mobility. And to see that represented in one of the stories here for me was just powerful the way that I forget the exact, it was one of the first stories, but a
Hmm.
woman was speaking, a disabled woman speaking about how she was looking for a place to live, and there's all of these limitations. Like, I can get to the bus stop at this apartment that I want to go see, but I can't get from that bus stop to the apartment. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't actually be able to live there. Just little things like that. So much disconnection. And I love that you really just highlight how those things are related and intersecting. And I have a few more questions, and I'd also like to let everyone know that feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll have our other co-hosts relaying those to us, and we'll have some room for Q&A. And another question that I'd like to ask, something really important, is there seems to be this stigma around people who don't drive, people who take transit, what kind of people, stereotypes, just that stigma about taking the bus instead of driving or not owning your own vehicle. How do you think that we can change this perception?
Oh my gosh, yeah. The stigma piece is very real, right? And I think, because I mean, for people, some people with some kinds of disabilities, like driving is just never going to be an option. But for many other folks, driving is so aspirational. And so it's really hard to talk about, okay, we need to fight for better transit because actually you're not going to be able to afford a car anytime soon, right? Like that's not something you want to tell someone. And so, yeah, I think, that stigma is so deep. And part of it, right, is because like, we've spent our whole lives, and anytime you turn on a TV, or whatever, the ads are everywhere for car ads, right? That lifestyle, that like, all that messaging around freedom, right? And all the messaging around like the car lifestyle, like things that you can do, like go to the outdoors and have a big house in the suburbs, and like there's just so much advertising that we're subjected to that we think that is like that's sort of the values that we absorb. And then like the other thing too, right, you see a lot of movies where like, okay, there's someone who doesn't have a car, and the narrative arc is that they're like a loser because they don't have a car, and then maybe they get a car, right? So um yeah, that stigma piece is hard, and I think for me it's important to call it out though too, right? Because I like when I talk to people about riding the bus. First of all, there's like this, like, oh, people want to ride the light rail, but not the bus, right? Because the train is somehow like, nicer and whiter and wealthier, right? And especially even among transit advocates who want to fight for light rail or train service, but not, aren't as committed to bus service. I think it's important to call that out and just ask people to think about why they're pushing for certain things, and what stigmas they have around bus service and who rides the bus. And yeah, so I think that piece in our advocacy work, being really clear that yeah, that stigma is within transportation advocacy as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is something that I, as an advocate, have really seen is this focus on advocating for the light rail and the trains because that's sort of the like ideal way to take transit to a lot of people, specifically people who have not taken transit before. It's fun. Everybody loves the train. The bus associated with, a lot of other stereotypes, and people have fear and anxiety about taking the bus. Something that I've learned in order to sort of dispel some of those misperceptions is just invite my friends with me. Hey, we're going to go to this place and we're going to take the bus. And it's not so bad. And people
Yeah.
end up enjoying that experience and learning, like, wow, I was so much less stressed. We didn't have to pay for parking. We didn't have to like wait
Mhm.
in traffic or, all of those little things that come with driving in cars. So I think that really just bringing people into that experience, taking them along the ride with us can be just impactful for people, in addition to adjusting our language and our focus within advocacy.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing on that. It's super important. I'd also like to ask about how can we bring in drivers as allies? Something that you mentioned in this book is that a lot of people choose to drive out of convenience. It's what makes the most sense for them.
Yeah.
And that's totally fine. But how do we bring those people into our space as of us who are non-drivers and bring them in as allies to advocate for this?
Gosh, that one's tricky. And I think it really like, I think it depends on the person. I have to say, having done book talks now since the book came out in May, some of the audiences have felt a bit hostile when I go to like a State Department of Transportation, for example. And the people in those spaces, when the room is sort of like, I don't know, the people who have been most supportive and come up to me afterwards are usually folks who have a family member who has either a disability and can't drive or is aging out of driving, or a teenager or a young person in their household who is choosing not to get a driver's license. And I think, then there's a lot of understanding. And so, I think part of it is having people sort of recognize that there are people who can't drive, and that the system isn't serving them. And you mentioned Week Without Driving, right? But like for me, that's what Week Without Driving is about, is helping drivers understand a little bit more what it's like to be a non-driver. And part of that is riding transit maybe, or walking somewhere they hadn't walked before. A big piece that I've seen, and actually I think one of the most interesting pieces for me, I didn't really think about this going into it, was for drivers to have to ask someone for a ride. Like my parents are always like, "Oh, I can give you a ride. Like, why are you so stressed about not driving?" And it's like, well, it's not so easy to ask for rides everywhere. And I think drivers don't understand that until they're in the position of asking for rides. And then the reflections we got from folks, elected leaders in particular, that was like, God, like, I could ask to rides to go to a work meeting, but I couldn't ask for a ride to go to the social thing because I just felt bad. I'd already asked for a bunch of rides, and then I didn't go to the social thing, and then I felt kind of isolated. And, like that reflection, I think is important, because the ride piece, at least in Washington State, where we were able to get a study funded around like how non-drivers get around, asking for rides is the way most non-drivers get around, and getting rides from other people, right? But that comes with, with an emotional cost or a burden that you are, yeah, it's not the same. So I forget where we started, but that's where that question ended up for me.
There's so much. There's so much. Yeah, the thing about the rides, I have definitely experienced this feeling dependent upon other people to get where you need to go. That's something that I feel like just stays in the body and we don't really address explicitly. And something that you did was address that in this book. And one of the stories that I remember that just stays with me is the story that highlighted how people become isolated when they're not able to get where they need to go, and they don't feel independent in their community because of the infrastructure issues, lack of transit, bad sidewalks, lack of connectivity. And so I think that is such an important thing to just really center in this, is how building good walkable transit-oriented infrastructure is not only important for us to get around and be mobile, but to allow us to engage with our community and to be present in the world and to show up and be social. So that was something that I just really resonating with me. And speaking of stories, I wanted to ask you, because there are so many great stories in this book, and they're all firsthand, real people, real stories, real raw emotions. And I'd love to know, what are some of your favorite conversations that you had, or are there any specific stories that just stay with you?
Oh my gosh, that one's hard. I mean, because it's like, the people that I got to interview are people that I met, doing the organizing work years ago, and have gotten to know. I couldn't interview all 300 people for the book, but they all, like, I know that they're all fighting in their own ways to make things better, and so it's hard to pick favorites. But I will, since I had a picture of her earlier, I'm going to talk about Abby, who worked with me for about a year and a half, 2 years as a fellow. And she became blind as a child, and then was adopted, to live in a rural area in Washington State. And so, was a teenager in a rural area. And I think she and I had that very like the similar experience. While our younger childhoods were very different. We both were like teenagers in a rural area in Washington State without a lot of transit, having to ask our moms for rides places, and that feeling of just like dependence that felt hard. And then she was able to move, and she talks about this in the book, but able to move to nearby city, Vancouver, Washington, which is across the river from Portland, and get an apartment. And it was near a bus stop, and she could take that bus to the grocery store, and she could take that bus to meet friends, and just like that, this giant weight had lifted off her shoulders. And I think that gets to what we were talking about before, but that like the emotional piece of this that I don't know, I think in a lot of traditional transit planning, we don't get into that as well, or we're not able to ask the right questions. And there's one metric that sort of gets there. I talk about it in the book a little bit, the Transportation Security Index, and it has questions around, how many times in the last month did you have to give up going somewhere because you felt like you couldn't ask for a ride, right? Like things like that, where it's not just like, is there a bus stop within a quarter mile of your house? It's like, what is that experience there like for you, and are you able to access it? Which I think are just as important as whether the physical infrastructure, exists in some ways. So yeah. And I see Jonathan just popped up with a hand.
I just I just first want to say, like, y'all, Anna is so the real deal in every single way. I have been following her work for so long. I've been putting some links in the chat, and I can't stress enough just to be checking these out. Link them, open them up in your browsers. The Week Without Driving campaign. This is a solid little book commercial too, like mid like questions, because I want to quickly read just something from the chapter titles, just really quick. Despite what you think, not everyone drives is the introduction. Non-drivers are everywhere, chapter 1. Chapter 2, what non-drivers need. Chapter 3, non-drivers need what everyone needs. Here's how we get it. Chapter 4, valuing the expertise of non-drivers, a conclusion, and then the epilogue is what you can do right now. I just can't stress enough that this book has really, really raw lived stories, really practical examples of like how deep Anna's work really goes in policies, in governments, with engineers, with planners, but with more than anything, with real everyday people. So I just I just want to lift up Anna's work. As Anna shared, like we connected in a similar way through the Pedestrian Dignity Network around, and everything that Nica just shared too in the introduction, but just these nuances, like the actual nuances of what a human story goes through when you can't drive a car, and really doing storytelling around that, moving with hundreds of people. So I just want to lift up Anna's work, this book. I put the discount code for all webinar folks in here. So please like share that code. Get the book for your people, get the book for your city town engineers, get the book for your local city planners, so that it's literally on their desk, and then there's maybe a walk and roll event after they read it. Like this is a manual that has heart and lived integrity. And so I just a little big
Aw.
plug of this is Anna's book is really a solid next step for how we get to some of the roots around these wonderful questions that Nika's asking. So um,
Can
thank
I
you.
add just one more thing to that? It's an
Please.
expensive book, at least I don't know. I don't buy books a lot. Request it from your library, because then more people get to read it too, and libraries will order it. I'm doing actually a big book event with Seattle Public Library in September, but libraries do order books that people request, and so if you put in the request form or whatever the process is at your local library, that's another great way to get it in the hands of more people. So highly encourage that.
Yeah, and I just echo everything that Jonathan has said. And we will be doing a raffle too, to receive a copy of the book. So stick around to the end. We'll be doing that, selecting one of you. And yeah, just speaking about this book as like a manual, something that we can teach our elected officials, our public servants. How do you think that we can really communicate that sense of urgency that us as pedestrians feel to those in power, people who maybe have never taken the bus or never ridden the train or walked or biked anywhere or used a wheelchair or mobility aid. How can we really create that sense of urgency?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the tools that Pedestrian Dignity uses, well, two tools that Pedestrian Dignity uses are great tools, right? The walk roll audit where or experience where you're asking elected leaders to come out, or community members to come out and experience what it's like to be in a place and what it feels like to try to cross the street. Or wait at a bus stop. I think that is so powerful if you can get folks there and you have enough pull to make that happen. That's wonderful. Sometimes if you don't have that pull right away though, right? People don't respond to your emails, they don't want to do it. And so using social media as a tool to show what it's like. And Pedestrian Dignity does this great. And I'll tell a story of I was doing an event this past weekend. It's actually a really cool event called Ian's Ride, where Ian Mackey, who I interview in my book, but he's a wheelchair user and organizes this thing called Sea to Sound. He does a bunch of rides, but there's one, they're all wheelchair accessible, and he arranges for wheelchair providers to bring test chairs for people who want to try power chairs or power, some of the like clip-on power device systems that exist now, and it arranges all the transportation. Anyway, they're wonderful. I was doing one of these, and we're on this beautiful trail in Washington State, and there's one highway that we had to cross. It's just like the trail just like goes up to the highway, and there's highways just going, and you have to like wait and kind of dash across as fast as you can. And you can imagine, it's a group that it's about 100, 130 people, most, maybe half in wheelchairs. And it's not like an easy thing to dash across a freeway. And it was pouring down rain. And so I took a video clip of us trying to get across this freeway, and I put it on TikTok first, not just Twitter. Anyway, they got a lot of traction, right? And the state DOT is now responding on Twitter. And it's something I had talked to them about before, but they just weren't, it wasn't a priority for them. And I think the pressure on social media now to try to do something about this crossing is creating momentum. So now I'm sure, like, if we went out and we're like, hey, do you want to come walk this with us and feel what it's like to try to cross here? They couldn't say no. And there's also the record, I think, maybe because my day job is I work for a disability rights organization that has a lot of lawyers. I think there's the fear that once something is documented and the city is supposed to be aware of it, then they could be liable. And so it tends to get things moving a little faster too, is if it's out there and publicly, shown to be really dangerous, and you tag the city and you tag the people who work at the city, and so those are the things that I can suggest, and they're things that I know you all are already doing, but keep doing them. And I think the last piece I'll add to is, in this work, making sure that the people who are taking part in it and who are leading the work are folks who are from the most impacted communities, because there's power in that. And at the end of the day, in my experience, it's people who this is our life, this is their life, right? Like, this isn't going to change, who are the most committed at the end of the day to see something through and put in the years of work, right, to get something to change. Because they know that, it's going to be like this for them forever, right? And so there's a passion and a drive there and a commitment to the work in the long term that I think we can really tap into.
Absolutely. Yeah, just second all of that. I think something that I've seen in our work with Pedestrian Dignity is really just that first piece, bringing out folks in our city state agencies to the street to feel and experience what we do, because that is something that really just stays with people on a subconscious level, and can inform their work as they go back into their boardrooms and offices and make decisions for us. You won't forget being out in the middle of a snowstorm and trying to cross the freeway, or trying to navigate a sidewalk that suddenly ends, or using a wheelchair if you're not a wheelchair user, and really experiencing the difficulty of that. So I think that just live experience is so impactful. And as you said too, with the social media, adding public pressure, also adding awareness, education, really showing what these experiences look like from a firsthand perspective is so incredibly powerful and impactful to folks. So I am with you on that. And yeah, and I would encourage others to who are not advocates but feel like they want to speak up about this or speak about their experiences. Something that I do is I'll just take pictures or videos of little things that I encounter on my day-to-day where I'm like, this sidewalk has a giant hole in it. That doesn't work for me. Or this crosswalk isn't really a crosswalk. There's no stop sign here. Things like that, because there are so many nuances that really get missed, I think, in that decision-making level. And so just the documentation of that is so important. So I'm so happy that you highlighted those things. And we'll be getting into some Q&A a little bit, but I just have one last question for you. Anna, what is one key insight that you are hoping that people will take away from this book?
I think it's from like the root of it is the visibility, right? Like that non-drivers exist, that not everyone drives, and that we've built car-dependent communities with the assumption that everyone drives or has someone who can drive them, and that isn't the way it is. And so we have the opportunity, because there really are so many non-drivers, to really challenge that car dependency, and in centering the voices of non-drivers, and particularly non-drivers who have the least choices, it's possible to build a coalition big enough to demand change. And that's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of organizing. Organizing is slow, organizing is hard, organizing is not, it's like the job that people get right out of college and then you get to go do something else, right? It's not seen as like a valid skill. But it really is a skill, and I think that's what we got to do is build enough momentum, right, to change things, and that starts with being okay. We are there's so many people that the system isn't serving well currently, and we've got to change things.
I love that. And yeah, something that along this line that stays with me at the very end of the book, you speak about thinking about who isn't in the room, in that decision-making space, who is not being represented here. That is just so clear, the way that you put that. And I think that is just such a huge part of this, is making sure that we are thinking about and bringing those folks into these spaces, so that we can just talk openly and freely about these issues and be represented. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. And I'd like to open up our Q&A to the room. So if you all have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, and then we will have Jonathon and or Justin or Alejandra relaying those to Anna.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the great conversation. I could keep talking all night with you. This is great. It's really, really insightful questions, and clear how, it's just great. And I can't see the chat, so go for it. I somehow stuck myself in full screen, and I don't think I can get out. So go for it.
I was just going to say that I have a question for you just about the process of writing the book. I think what makes the book so effective and like personal is just there's so many anecdotes with so many people throughout. And I was wondering, did you like seek people out for the book, or are these people that you already knew, and how did you interview them and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was folks who I already were connected with through the work I'd done in Washington State. I think there was a lot of negotiation with my publisher because the book was so Washington State focused, and they're like, well, is it going to be relevant to a national audience? And they were like, can you just go to some other states and do this at other states? And I was like, nope. It was like 3 years of really hard work to find the right people, because it's not the people that are necessarily most online or most activisty, right, whose stories need to get out there. So so there was some amount of trying to find new stories, but really most of it was being able to talk to and interview the folks that I that I knew. One thing I think that was a little different for this publisher, but in the disability community, there's a real desire to make sure that people are compensated for sharing their stories, because that is work, right? And there is knowledge there that often is just taken. And so without compensation or really acknowledgement of what's being shared. And so I asked the publisher if I could pay people for doing interviews with me, which is not standard journalism practice, right? You don't do that in journalism. And so they were kind of like, I don't know, but got it approved. And so I was able to take my my stipend for writing the book and basically divide it up by the people I interviewed. So it wasn't a lot of money for each of them, but it was at least something, and I felt good about doing that. And yeah, I think yeah, I wish, I mean, yeah, in like the ideal world, there'd be some like, not that the book is making money, but like ways to like make sure that people are continuing to benefit from their stories being out there in the world. And so I have been trying to, as I can, and do a compensation to do events, like bring in some of the people and make sure they get compensated. But that's tricky because a lot of this is not high budget work. So there's that balance of trying to get the word out and trying to make sure people are paid.
Yeah, that is huge, and just really highlighting this this key aspect of what you said, that advocacy is work, telling your story is work. That is something that I feel like just gets so like glossed over when it comes to storytelling and advocacy. So I love that.
Yeah.
And do we have, Jonathan, do we have any other questions in the chat that we could bring up?
Can I just add one more thing to what you just said, Nica? I mean, I think
Yeah, of course.
there's also, and part of like, so my background is in video. And so my skill set is, oh, you should make like a documentary or a bunch of social media videos with these stories, right? And that's how to get the word out. And I thought about that a lot. And part of why I wrote a book was because it was a way for me to have people be able to share their stories in a way that felt controlled without sort of like, I feel like with disability, there's often a lot of sort of like gawking that happens, right? With the visuals of it. And so how to like be really intentional to like kind of get rid of as much of that as I could while still centering disability. And so it's still something I wrestle with, because I think there still is like, oh, it's disability and it's interesting because it's weird and different, and like that sort of sense that you get where people are drawn to something. But yeah, so that was another part of it too, and something I think a lot about with images in particular, and what images and we share, and who gets to share what images.
Yeah, absolutely. And this book has so many wonderful images in it. So I love that you really have both of those elements, the deep, nuanced writing plus the visuals. I think it comes together so great. And I see we do have another question in our chat. Jonathan, would you mind reading that off for us?
Absolutely. I just want to double down really quick on the stipends for storytellers, resident voice. I can't stress it enough. It's imperfect, as Anna said. There's not a lot of resources, but gosh, the dignity of this. And so just really lifting that. I know there's agencies in this room. So just thinking about, as you think about integrating resident voice, resident participation, that upfront, building in your budget for compensating that time is such a gift. And so,
Okay, before you do the next question, I'm just going to say one thing, because I heard this news today, and it is really exciting news. And especially if there's agency folks here, this is a great example. But Inner City Transit, which is the transit agency in Thurston County in Washington State, they have community members who sit on their transit board, which is awesome. And our voting members. They also have a community advisory board, and just this month they authorized compensation for members of that community advisory board for their transit agency, which not a lot of transit agencies do. I don't think no other ones in our state. So huge step forward, allows people to have the time and like really dedicate the resources to becoming really valuable transit agency representatives, and then hopefully transitioning from that advisory role into a full board member, and having say over what happens with transit in that community. So Great example, intercity transit rocks, and hopefully we'll get some news out about that soon.
Oh, love to hear it.
Yeah.
Love to hear it. Thank you, Anna. Okay, I'm going to read this question from Anna. In the book, you point out that there are sometimes design conflicts with growing bike design solutions that maintain or increase access for disabled people while improving safety for cyclists. This is an ongoing balance in Denver. Any suggestions or projects you've seen that helped solve some conflicts here?
Yeah, this is such a good question. Actually, very relevant to what I'm thinking about right now. But I know we have some folks here in Washington State from our DRT who are thinking about floating bus stops and design guidelines for, in particular, with the blind community. I've heard that there's some conversation with ProAg happening as well, and around bus infrastructure and the ADA. And so these are really big questions. My sense of my just like big picture sense of it, and I don't have all the answers, and I think they're going to have to be negotiated over time, but it's just like we create these situations where we're creating conflict points between people riding bikes and people walking when we don't need to be, but because we don't want to deprioritize car movement, we create these conflict pinch points. And in Seattle, I see it all the time where they like don't want to actually take any car space, so they'll run the bike lane intentionally up onto the sidewalk at intersections. And I'm like, you're just creating a conflict point that doesn't need to be there. And I feel that way with a lot of bus infrastructure too. And actually, I like center bike lanes. That's my new thing. I think I've ridden some in San Francisco and DC. I know a lot of bike people don't like them, but I think it's a good way to make sure that we're not creating conflict between people waiting for the bus and people trying to get through on bikes. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anna. Can I ask a quick question while we wait for one more to go in the chat? Nica, is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, okay. There's also a lot of advocates in this space, some that are, I've just seen in all the comments. Thank you all just for being here. You know, your work, some of you are a part of formal organizations, some of you are just kind of grinding in a grassroots way. Some of you are on these committees that are unpaid. And so I just think of like, for those who've been doing this a while and who like, what are just a couple things, Anna, since you've been doing this for so long, like a couple burnout, this is so hard. This is just hard. This is like, if you, are there a couple things you do to help recalibrate, clear the mind, get creative for you as a longtime advocate around this stuff?
Oof, yeah, that burnout stuff is hard. I have to say, this past winter before the book came out, and I was like, it was done, and I was like, I don't know, it's gonna get reception. I'm really kind of exhausted. I want to do something totally different with my life, right? Like there is these moments for sure. And I think for me, it is coming back to that, like I'm doing this work because, not only because it's something that's going to impact me for the rest of my life, it's something that's going to impact my kid for the rest of his life. And so that motivation, helps. But, I've worked for political campaigns in my youth. I worked a long time in like the labor movement for labor unions. And there's like this mentality of it's like always a crisis and like you always have to be working extra, and like that's not sustainable either. And so I think we can have these moments of intensity and crisis around campaigns, but recognizing that that's not the way to do this work in the long term, because you just can't sustain it. You've got to figure out that balance. So I'm still struggling with what that balance looks like. I'm realizing for me, a lot of it is like, I really enjoyed writing. I didn't think I would. And so, taking the time writing for me, doing art, going on long bike rides, with my kid, like finding those things that step you away. And if there's things that, you just realize they suck your time and their energy and they make you angry and awful, like stepping back from those things and recognizing that maybe other people can do that part of the process. For me, I know that's like engaging with our state legislature, and the pay for play that often is entailed with like, just the amount of like expectations around donations is gross. And it makes me so angry. And it's so insular, and I realized that, there's people who are who can deal with it in a healthier way than I can. But for me, it becomes so deeply personal when they're deciding things about our state transportation budget and they drive everywhere and they do not care. Like, and so that anger like is not healthy for me. And I'm trying to figure out ways that that's not my day-to-day is dealing with that. So I don't know. There's a lot of things I just threw out there.
No,
It's a good
thank you.
question.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. I just trust it so much. Yeah, the imperfection of it and experimenting. Nica, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Anna, just for being so real about that. That's something that I relate to a lot, is just really holding so much space in my body for that anger, that stress, that frustration, and finding healthy ways to express that while also giving it the respect that it deserves, you know, that space that it deserves to hold, and an ongoing challenge and ongoing skill to develop. So I love what you are just speaking about this, the insight. And I think that is pretty much all of the questions I have that we can get to. I have so many others, but I'd love to just thank you, Anna, so much for being with us. And we're going to do our raffle in just a few minutes. But I just wanted to, again, extend my deepest thanks to you for this conversation, for writing this book, for creating just such an important, as Jonathan mentioned, manual, a guide for advocates, community members, drivers, non-drivers alike to really just center the needs of those of us and the solutions as well, the tangible steps for us to create a more inclusive, accessible, and sustainable space. So yeah, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you to our audience as well. Thank you for tuning in. Anna, feel free to let folks know where they can find you, your social media, website, anything that you'd like to share. And then I'll pass it back over to Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll put some stuff in the chat. I got the chat to come back up. My mouse had disappeared for a while, but it's back. So I'm gonna put in my email, the website, and then where I am on some socials. So yeah, thanks so much. This has been one of my favorite book conversations to date. You guys are the best. I'm glad it's being recorded because I want to share it out with folks if that's all right. So thank you.